In the earliest part of the development of environmental economics, we progressively focused on getting better and better information on what we were doing to the environment. And there was a set of incentives established for analysts to focus the resolution of their work on smaller and smaller spatial scales. So there was a mapping between the geography of the ecosystems affected and the behavior of the people. That has been enormously successful. In the process, we paid less attention to whether the proxy measures, the approximate measures of how the ecosystem or the services of the environment were changing, as long as those services were closely related to what people could observe and what people could act on. And that has been quite successful. The difficulty that poses is that every situation is a special case. I have to have a unique analysis for each situation because each has a separate proxy. That makes it impossible to discuss issues at the national level, to get on the national agenda, and we have to change that. This is a huge challenge, and the reason it's a challenge is because the rules of aggregation in economics rely to a very large extent on the ability to observe signals of importance of a commodity that individuals reveal through their behavior. Now, we also have signals of importance for non-market services that are provided, but they're linked to commodities. And so we have to understand that linkage in a much more systematic way across spatial scales in order to conduct the aggregation. We have to go back and remove the wrong measures and put in the right measures. Now, what do I mean by the wrong measures? Well, gross domestic product includes all the averting expenditures that people make to try to protect themselves from pollution. It includes all the expenditures that people are forced to make to pay higher rents and prices for housing because they want to live in unpolluted areas and not in polluted areas. That differential is picked up in the housing component of GDP, but it's picked up the wrong way because there is no systematic approach that keeps track of the levels of environmental services. In the housing component, it just looks like different paces of inflation across region and not differences in the services that are provided. It's those sorts of corrections that people are ignoring. It's a big process, and it requires a complete reorientation in the way we go about measuring the trade-offs that people would make for environmental and ecosystem services. So begin with establishing quantitative importance in a transparent, easy to understand framework. That's step one. Step two, look at the process in which we construct our national income and product accounts data and develop a parallel system that collects information in a systematic way on the environmental services and the linked goods and develop it up in a way that is consistent with top-down needs. Right now, we're focused exclusively on the bottom, which is a good thing. We want that spatial resolution. We understand that it's important, but we never consider at all what it means at the national level. And the two have to work together. developing and calibrating any computable general equilibrium model begins with a set of first principles. And primary among those first principles is the definition of the economic variables in a way that is consistent with consumer and firm choices. So, consumer and firm choices in a structured, closed economic description of behavior require an identification of the incentives that consumers face and how they respond to them. This is characterized in a set of first-order conditions. The incentives that firms require and how they respond to them. This is a parallel set of first-order conditions. And then there are a whole series of balancing conditions. Consumers can't spend more than they have. What they get to spend is a result of the resources that they own. Firms, in the presence of competition, are driven to the point that they must price when there is no profit, otherwise there's an incentive for new firms to enter, or you need to develop an explanation for why those profits exist. And the government, in these simple models, balances its budgets, or we give them a way to avoid that balance. In that structure, we need to add non-market resources. They are not chosen, but their presence affects choices. So the first thing we need to do is identify the structure of those choices and how we measure at an economy-wide level the services of the environment. And the second thing we have to do is to suggest that there are limits to what we can learn about those trade-offs, but we need to consistently integrate them into the model. That consistency requires two fundamental changes. The first is that every choice has to be consistent with its implications for the ecosystem. That is, if I decide to purchase more electricity and that leads to greater emissions of particulate matter, and the particulate matter affects air quality, which affects where I live, there is a link between my housing decision, the particulate matter, and the amount of electricity. Every choice in electricity affects the air quality where I live. I change where I live in response to what electricity I use, and so forth. That has to balance so that the level of particulates is consistent with the choices in housing and electricity in that simple example. The second thing is that if my behavior is going to be consistent between the market and the non-market, I have to define an income concept that reconciles the two, and that is called virtual income. Those two changes are enormously important to the structure of general equilibrium modeling in a static or in a dynamic context, and both are rather difficult to implement, but feasible.